Well, hello, everybody. Welcome along to another special episode of the Unorthodox Podcast, the podcast where right and wrong aren't always black and white. I'm Sadiq Tabale, and every week we dive into the murky waters of ethical dilemmas, the kind that don't come with a rule book or a clear path forward. From the everyday choices that quietly shape who we are to the complex moral puzzles that make us question everything. We're here to explore them all. No easy answers, no moral high ground, just honest conversations about the difficulty of doing what's right when right isn't so obvious. So, if you ever found yourself stuck between your values and your reality, questioning the choices we make and why, you're in the right place. This is the Unorthodox Podcast. Let's get uncomfortable. In recent months, the United Kingdom has been at the forefront of a profound and emotional debate on the legalization of assisted dying. This discussion was reignited by the introduction of the terminally ill adults end of life bill in late 2024, aiming to permit assisted dying for terminally ill adults with a prognosis of 6 months to a year. Labour MP Kim Ledbetter, who spearheaded the bill, emphasized a cautious approach, drawing parallels to Oregon's Death with Dignity Act, which requires the concurrence of 2 doctors and judicial oversight. Public support for such legislation appears substantial. A March 2024 poll commissioned by Dignity in Dying indicated that 75% of respondents favored legalizing assisted suicide. However, the debate remains complex, with concerns about potential pressures on vulnerable groups and the ethical implications of such a law. I thought about this episode because I was watching a segment which had one of my favorite people, former MP Rory Stewart, who was on a panel and they were discussing this ethical issue, this thing about euthanasia. Euthanasia comes from the Greek words eu, or good, and thanatos, death. It refers to the practice of intentionally ending a person's life to alleviate their suffering. It is categorized primarily into 2 forms. There's active euthanasia and there's passive euthanasia. Active euthanasia is the deliberate actions taken to cause a patient's death, such as administering a lethal injection. Passive euthanasia is withholding or withdrawing life-sustaining treatments, allowing the patients to die naturally. Physician-assisted suicide, or else PAS, is a related concept where a doctor provides a patient with the means to end their own life, typically through prescribed medication. As of 2025, euthanasia and or physician-assisted suicide are legal in several jurisdictions. In the Netherlands, decriminalized both euthanasia and assisted suicide in 2001, allowing doctors to assist patients experiencing unbearable suffering. In Belgium, they legalized euthanasia in 2002 for patients with constant and unbearable physical or mental suffering. In Luxembourg, They permitted euthanasia and assisted suicide since 2009, and Canada legalized medical assistance in dying made in 2016, with subsequent expansions to include serious chronic conditions. Spain approved euthanasia in 2021 for individuals with serious and incurable diseases. New Zealand enacted the End of Life Choice Act in 2021, allowing assisted dying for terminally ill patients. In Australia, several states, including Victoria, Western Australia, have legalized voluntary assisted dying. Switzerland permits assisted suicide since 1937, provided there is no selfish intent involved. In the United States, physician-assisted suicide is legal in 11 states, beginning with Oregon's Death with Dignity Act in 1997. The legalization of euthanasia and assisted suicide has led to both intended and unintended consequences, as one might imagine. The intended impacts: autonomy and dignity. Patients gain control over their end-of-life decisions, potentially reducing prolonged suffering. In some regions, the option of assisted dying has prompted improvements in palliative care services. The unintended impact is the normalization concerns from some. There's apprehension that assisted dying may become a normalized option, potentially influencing vulnerable individuals. Some say it's a slippery slope. Critics argue that initial restrictions might gradually expand, encompassing non-terminal conditions or mental health issues. There are ethical considerations for such a thing. I don't know what I would do if I was faced with the decision to end my life or not to end it. I cannot speak for people who have unbearable pain where they feel like the only solution is to end their lives. Down here, I had a friend whom, because of the nature of his job, when he took his life, it was a shock to the community. For days, people were wondering where he was. I got a call one day asking, did I know where this gentleman was? And I did not know, because it was such an odd request. He's a family guy. He has kids. A lot of them are grown, in high school, I believe one in college. But it became as a shock when his wife didn't know where he was. He went outside of the norms of the things he did. And I have to be honest with you, it's difficult for me to try and put myself in his shoe and to imagine that that was the only option he had. I don't know what could have been so painful and so unbearable about that, for him to engage in such an act. I know, especially for religious folk like us, sometimes it's easier to completely condemn. I know denominations that wouldn't even perform a funeral for said individual if that was to happen. So even within religious groups, there's varying perspectives on suicide. So imagine an assisted suicide. I know when I was watching that program, there were some considerations that people were having, and it was obviously, like I mentioned, they didn't want it to be a slippery slope, and they didn't want it to become commonplace that people just think, oh, it's like going to the grocery store, because it's so readily available, and that as an option. So there's a little apprehension from, even, to be fair, proponents of it. And there are people who make the argument that, well, how do we know that that person didn't just want to end their life because they didn't want to be a burden to their family? And the questions just keep on coming. Well, is it right for them to be a burden to their family? And another question is, well, how could they possibly be a burden to their family? Just within those two questions, we already see the gambit. We already see the divergent way that people are thinking about assisted suicide or euthanasia. It's a difficult question. I personally have a lot of friends that have contemplated suicide, and I wonder at times if they had the option to end their lives through a legal or medical prescription, would they? It's baffling, but also empathy comes into place, and you start to just wonder what could be so terrible. But then again, I'm assuming that in their mind that they think it's terrible, because who knows? There could be some that might think that that is the best thing. I don't know. I don't know what's going through someone's mind for them to want to make that decision. But like we say all of the time and on this podcast, is people are gonna make the decisions they're gonna make. Our goal is, even when they choose the thing we don't agree with, how do we show them grace? The ethical discourse surrounding euthanasia goes around several arguments. There's one of a person's autonomy, right? So proponents assert that individuals have the right to choose a dignified death, especially when facing unbearable suffering. And again, I don't ever want to do anything that violates another person's autonomy. I have to believe in that person's right to choose the thing they want to do with their own body. Doesn't mean I agree with it, but it's their choice. I think a lot of times we find it hard, and we want to make choices for people when, in fact, in truth, and in all honesty, people need to make their own decisions. Yes, it could hurt us and it could hurt the people around them, but it is their own prerogative. And now we have to deal with that, and you have to sit in that space in which you deal with this notion of, this is my own right, and I have the right to take my own life. That's difficult. It's got to be a difficult decision for the person that is taking it. It's got to be a difficult decision for their family. And in all honesty, it has to be a difficult decision for the healthcare worker that is engaging in that act. Medical ethics emphasize acting in the patient's best interest and avoiding harm. Supporters believe that assisting in death can be a compassionate response to suffering, while opponents view it as a violation of the Hippocratic Oath. how do you make that decision as a healthcare worker when there's this ethos of do no harm, but here the thing you have to do for the benefit of the patient is to do the thing they want you to do. But then again, some would argue, well, we already do that with DNRs. For those of us from the global south, that just means do not resuscitate. Essentially, that is a form of assisted suicide. Granted, not to the exact same impact as someone that is fully sane and fully alive, and well, they are still alive even though there's the DNR. But for people to say, the people that are within their conscious mind have decided that this final act is the one that ends my life, that is a little different. But obviously some would argue the overarching impact is withholding care leads to that person's death. That's what happens with the DNR. Many religious and cultural traditions uphold life as inviolable, opposing any form of intentional life-ending practices. There are also concerns of coercion, in which when I was watching this episode, that is one thing that I thought was a salient point. Because you start to wonder, yes, that person might be choosing euthanasia. But are they doing it because someone had kind of psychologically nudged them toward that? Are they doing it really because that's what they really want to do? How do we know where their desire ends and where their families begins? It's murky. It's a difficult decision. The debate over euthanasia is not new. Ancient Greek and Roman societies had practiced this, or something that could be called euthanasia. However, with the rise of Hippocratic tradition, medical ethics began to emphasize the preservation of life. In modern times, discussions resurfaced in the early 20th century, but it wasn't until the late 20th and early 21st centuries that countries began to legislate on the matter. Philosophers like John Stuart Mill have argued for individual autonomy, suggesting that individuals should have sovereignty over their own bodies and minds, which informs a lot of contemporary arguments for euthanasia. For societies contemplating the legalization of euthanasia, there are several practical aspects which must be addressed. One, we have to establish robust safeguards, establishing strict criteria and oversights to ensure that only eligible individuals can access assisted dying services. Another could be palliative care, by ensuring that high quality palliative care is available so that euthanasia is not seen as the only option for those suffering. And another could be training healthcare professionals at providing education and support for medical practitioners involved in assisted dying to navigate the ethical concerns. It's very difficult to talk about such a thing. Because when discussing euthanasia within an ethical framework, particularly in societies that have been influenced by Judeo Christian values. The Bible often serves as a foundation or foundational text for a lot of the arguments and the practice. So it's easy to see that a lot of opponents of euthanasia would reference scripture, right? Especially passages that highlight themes of the sanctity of life or divine sovereignty and human suffering. And that sanctity of life notion, it does have a lot of principles that is rooted in several scriptures that people point to. And one of them is Genesis 1:27, where it says, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them." So this is underscoring the inherent value that we as human beings have in this created world. That we are made in the image of God and we're beautiful even the way we are. And thus, people would argue committing suicide or euthanasia is violating that imago Dei, if you will. And also, for others, euthanasia could be a form of murder, right? And you know that Bible verse, Exodus 20:13, where it says, "You shall not murder." That commandment that people cite often. You see that as a clear prohibition of killing. Though, obviously some people would argue that there's a difference between mercy killing and murder. And then what do we do with capital punishments, right? It's a difficult argument. The biblical argument against euthanasia is predominantly rooted in that sanctity of life argument, that God's sovereignty over our life and death, and so it's God that is making us live, and when we die, then it's essentially, by that logic, is God deciding that it's time. And it's difficult also for other Christians when you have that kind of empathetic thing, that compassion for other people, what they're going through, and you want to make the argument that compassion lies deep in providing care, So how do we decide on this murky question? It's very difficult to decide. And it's on the one hand, if we're going to make the argument for the morality of euthanasia, I think the same argument will or should also be used for any form of killing. Because at the point where it comes, you start to ask, well, is there a justified killing, right? How do we justify killing? We can say, oh, in the context of war, it's okay to kill other people. Sometimes we want it to be just black and white. Murder is wrong, period. So no abortion, no people taking their lives at the end. And then people would say, okay, let us be consistent, and let us be consistent by saying no capital punishment. Because that is actually kind of like a reverse euthanasia, right? It's the person not necessarily wanting to die, but is provided, death is provided for them against their will. So is it wrong for you to ask for death on your own will, or is it wrong when others bring death upon you? Or is it right when people bring death upon you? Should it be wrong in euthanasia? Or should it be wrong, and should it be right in capital punishment? Which one is right? And again, I think that's at the heart of the question of autonomy, right? Because if we're violating other people's autonomy, aren't we doing that with capital punishment? And if we're logically consistent, we can say, yeah, aren't we doing that with abortion? Where essentially we're terminating life, right? I understand a lot of people will find exception to this, and I don't blame you. Listen, again, this is why this is murky, and this is the gray, right? This is that gray area in which we're living in this world where we try to rationalize things in one way and we accept them in another. Should murder be wrong in all instances? Or is the reason why we murder the thing that justifies our act? Or I kill that person in self-defense. Or if I didn't kill that person, then that person would have killed me. I get it. This is a tough conversation. And believe me, if you don't want to have this conversation, that's fair. That's fine. I don't blame you. I don't begrudge you. However, these are the things that run through my mind. I just start to think about random things, and a lot of things pique my interest, and I just have questions, and these questions keep ringing. So I just figure I might just put it out into the ether, see what happens. Maybe there are people that think like me. Maybe there are people that are also wondering about these difficult questions. Why is it wrong for someone to take their life, but it is okay for another to take their life? Is it the context that makes it okay? Excuse me. I know from the place where I come from, it's probably going to be very odd for people to hear this kind of conversation because I come from the global south. I come from Nigeria specifically, and a lot of people there's some things that we just don't talk about. And I'm not that kind of person, so maybe I don't know, maybe I'm just weird. I want to talk about everything, especially the things that pique my interest. I will talk to them. I'll listen to other people that are way smarter than I am. And thinking philosophically and logically about such difficult decisions, I don't begrudge people that have to make these decisions. It's not something that I have to decide for myself. But for those who are deciding this, I can imagine somebody, like again, when I was watching that episode, I was imagining somebody that was in a lot of pain, debilitating pain, been bed bound for a long time. And I believe one of the panelists spoke about this, that she assisted her mother in ending her life, and it was the hardest thing she had to do. She didn't want to do it, but it was what her mother wanted, and she was feeling guilty about it. So obviously there's a lot of like internal dialogue that is happening there, right? And it's the conflict that happens in each and every one of us when we have to decide on these difficult questions on what to do in such a moment. I get it, life is precious. And we want people to live it. And I think this is where, for me, it becomes difficult because you have to talk about death. Do you bring it upon yourself, or people bring upon you, or it just happens one way or the other? Like, it's one thing that is the reality of us all on this side of reality. How do you choose? How do you choose? And if you do choose that, what is the difficulty for you choosing that? How does that change you as an individual? I can imagine it must be painful and difficult for such a person to decide that you're the one that is going to end the life of your loved one. Or maybe the physician that is performing this care, to have to be the one to do this. I imagine, yes, we can try and compartmentalize, but it's a very difficult thing because you don't know if this person, their quality of life could improve, even if you know it cannot improve, and yet you have to be the one. They're not in any imminent danger. However, you have to speed up their decision to terminate this existence. It's difficult. And also at times I think about how it is wild that we have arrived at this point in life. That the only choice people have to end their pain, to end their suffering, is to take their own life. That's difficult. I was talking to a friend the other day, and he told me about times that he thought about such things. I have a lot of friends that have told me that same thing, and I'm like, and I start to think about it. I'm like, have I ever thought this? Again, and then I always arrive at this juncture where I start to wonder how much that pain could be that someone would rather just end it. I want to understand why somebody would. You see, I know I don't talk to a lot of people. I'm kind of like a recluse. Kind of keep to myself a lot. So it's also baffling for people to find out that, yeah, I am a recluse. I keep to myself. But I'm kind of an eternal optimist. I'm very optimistic about life. I'm excited to wake up every single day. I'm excited for all the things. And so, but then again, I don't want to become the person who projects my own like visions of life or visions of reality onto other people, you know? Because I'm like, and also I'm not sure if I'm completely honest. I really want to know what is going through that person's mind that they choose that. It's a difficult decision. And that's the gray. Because we all have instincts to not want to prolong the pain in people's life. Think about this. Imagine someone is living with Alzheimer's, with dementia. They don't remember who their kids are at all. They have no recollection of what reality is. Essentially, all we're doing is waiting. which is sad. It's a sad existence. I don't begrudge people that have to deal with that. I pray for them. Man, I just have compassion for people who have to make those decisions, and I don't know how to deal with it. I'm incapable of dealing with it. I'm not equipped to deal with it. So maybe a little compassion would be the thing that we engage in. That people are gonna make the choices that they're gonna make. And yeah, recent years has forced me to come to the point where I start to be a little more compassionate to people, be more forgiving, be more gracious, be more loving, be more kind, and suffer along them, because that is what my calling is in this world, is to be the representative of the kingdom of heaven to people. And granted, listen, if you have that side of theology that says, oh, they're gonna go to hell, they're gonna go to this, listen, at the end of the day, I'm not the one that judges them. There will come the day of the Lord where Jesus would decide, right? If we believe Daniel chapter 7, if we believe Revelation, there will come that day, and he's the only one equipped to judge that. What I'm called to do is to be the presence of a representative of the kingdom of heaven. Be that. Bear that fruit. And so, in their difficult moment, am I going to be peace? In their troubled life, am I going to be comfort? I don't know. It's tough. If you know somebody, or you might be that person that lives in one of these jurisdictions that has to deal with this reality, I'm sorry. I send you, in the name of all that is love, all that is peace, all that is comfort, I send you grace. It's a difficult reality to live. Difficult choice. In ethics, rarely is there a clear right or wrong answer. Euthanasia forces us into the gray areas, where we're balancing empathy for individual suffering with the need to safeguard society. As we continue this conversation, perhaps the most important thing we can do is to approach it with humility, compassion, and a willingness to listen. Because when deciding on matters of life and death is as much about understanding our humanity as it is about our ethical principles. In the words of the always brilliant Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the ultimate test of a moral society is the kind of world that it leaves to its children. May you make the best decisions that you can. May you be forgiving to yourselves when you get it wrong. May you be gracious to others when they make their difficult decisions. may you be gracious when they're wrong. Peace.